It began with fear, the kind of fear that reshapes nations. In 1947, the world stood on the edge of a new kind of war. The battlefields of World War II were quiet, but something far more dangerous had taken their place: a war for minds. The enemy was no longer a visible army, it was ideology. The Soviet Union had emerged as America's rival, spreading communism across Europe and Asia. Its weapon wasn't just tanks or bombs, it was words, stories, and propaganda. In Washington, the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency understood something that few others did. In the modern world, perception was power. Whoever controlled the narrative controlled the truth. And whoever controlled the truth controlled the people. So, in the first years of the Cold War, a plan was born. A plan to fight lies with lies, to combat propaganda with propaganda, not abroad, but at home. It began quietly, in offices without signs, with men whose names would never appear in history books. And it would grow into one of the most ambitious covert operations ever conducted on American soil. Its name was Operation Mockingbird. But to understand how it began, you have to go back to the end of World War II. When the war ended in 1945, the world was divided in two. On one side, the United States, the victor, rich, powerful, and armed with the atomic bomb. On the other, the Soviet Union, equally victorious, equally powerful, and determined to spread its ideology of communism across the world. Between them stood a void, a vacuum of influence, where hearts and minds were up for grabs. In those years, America faced an invisible invasion. Soviet propaganda flooded Europe, Asia, and even American universities. Moscow's messages promised equality, peace, and liberation from capitalist exploitation. Millions of people, disillusioned by the horrors of war, began to listen. In response, President Harry S. Truman signed the National Security Act of 1947, creating the CIA. Its mission was simple on paper: to gather foreign intelligence and prevent another surprise like Pearl Harbor. But behind closed doors, the agency's goals went far beyond that. The CIA was also tasked with fighting a war of ideas, a psychological war. Its first director, Roscoe Hillenkoetter, called it a battle for men's minds. And leading that battle was a man named Frank Wisner. Wisner was no ordinary bureaucrat. A former Wall Street lawyer turned spy, he had served in the Wartime Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, precursor to the CIA. He understood that wars weren't won by weapons alone, but by belief. In 1948, Wisner created a division inside the CIA known as the Office of Policy Coordination, or OPC. Its official purpose was to conduct psychological operations. Its unofficial mission: manipulate global perception in favor of the United States. Wisner called it his mighty Wurlitzer, a vast propaganda machine that could play any tune, and the world would dance to it. At first, the focus was abroad. The CIA funded anti-communist newspapers in Europe, bankrolled cultural organizations, and covertly supported artists, musicians, and writers. Jazz tours, literary magazines, and even art exhibitions were used as weapons in the cultural Cold War. American freedom was sold not through bullets, but through beauty, creativity, and the illusion of choice. But soon, the agency realized that it wasn't enough to fight the Soviets overseas. The real battleground was closer to home, the American media itself. In 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb. The same year, China fell to communism under Mao Zedong. Panic spread across Washington. Newspapers warned that America was losing the war of ideas. Senators demanded loyalty oaths, blacklists, and investigations. The CIA concluded that public opinion had to be managed, not just informed, but directed. And so, Operation Mockingbird began to take shape. It started small. The CIA quietly approached editors at major newspapers, men who had covered the war and trusted the intelligence community. They were told that America's survival depended on information control, that the press had a patriotic duty to help. Many agreed. They saw communism as an existential threat and believed that temporary secrecy was a small price to pay for national security. The agency offered funding, access to classified stories, and exclusive intelligence briefings. In exchange, these journalists would shape coverage, publish approved narratives, and occasionally spike stories that revealed too much. By the early 1950s, the network had expanded far beyond anyone's imagination. Hundreds of journalists across the country, some knowingly, others not, were publishing stories influenced or written directly by CIA operatives. Reporters from the New York Times, Time Magazine, Newsweek, The Washington Post, and CBS worked as assets, informants, or friendly sources. The agency planted articles in American papers that were then picked up by foreign outlets and re-imported back to the US as independent confirmation. The CIA called it information laundering. The public called it news. At its height, Operation Mockingbird's reach extended into nearly every major media institution in the Western world. The agency funded the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which secretly paid writers and intellectuals to promote pro-American ideals. It financed book publishing houses, commissioned films, and even worked with Hollywood producers to ensure movies portrayed U.S. foreign policy in a favorable light. One of the most influential operatives in the network was Cord Meyer, a former idealist turned Cold Warrior. He joined the CIA in 1951 and became Wisner's deputy. Meyer's task was to coordinate the press relationships, to make sure that the right stories reached the right audiences at the right time. He didn't need to lie, not outright. The trick was simpler. The agency would emphasize certain truths, bury others, and frame the facts in a way that favored America's narrative. The goal wasn't censorship, it was persuasion. It worked flawlessly. When the CIA orchestrated coups in Iran, 1953, and Guatemala, 1954, the American public read stories about spontaneous revolutions against tyranny, stories written by journalists who had no idea their information came directly from CIA briefings. The agency didn't just control the story, it controlled the very sources of the story. Behind the scenes, some began to question the ethics of it. Could a free press exist if it worked hand in hand with a spy agency? But to most editors, the logic was simple. If they didn't cooperate, the Soviets would win the propaganda war. And if the Soviets won, freedom itself would die. In this moral gray zone, the lines between patriotism and manipulation disappeared. Even as Operation Mockingbird expanded, its secrecy held. Few outside the agency knew of its existence. There were no written orders, no paper trails, only verbal agreements and untraceable payments. But by the late 1950s, something began to change. Television had replaced newspapers as America's dominant medium. Millions of families tuned in every evening to watch the news, and the CIA realized the power of the screen. Agency contacts were cultivated at CBS, NBC, and ABC. Producers were given guidance on which foreign stories to highlight and which to downplay. News anchors, the trusted faces of American truth, were sometimes briefed directly by intelligence officers before going on air. The public believed they were watching objective journalism. In reality, they were seeing carefully constructed narratives designed to reinforce national unity and justify America's global actions. By 1960, the CIA's media network had become so powerful that even Congress didn't fully understand its reach. The agency could plant or suppress virtually any story, anywhere. A single phone call could kill a headline. A single source could shift global perception. Frank Wisner had once bragged to colleagues that his mighty Wurlitzer was so finely tuned that when he played it, it would resonate through every newsroom in the world. But even as the machine hummed, cracks were forming. A new generation of journalists was coming of age, skeptical, independent, and unwilling to take the government's word for truth. They had grown up under McCarthyism and seen what fear could do to democracy. To them, the press wasn't a weapon of the state. It was a shield against it. The clash between these two visions, between secrecy and transparency, control and freedom, was about to explode. And it would happen in the most unlikely of decades, the 1970s, when the shadows of the CIA's invisible empire would finally begin to surface. But before the curtain was pulled back, before the word Mockingbird was ever whispered in public, the agency had already rewritten the rules of journalism. It had proven that truth itself could be engineered, and that, in the right hands, information could be the most powerful weapon on Earth. By the early 1950s, America had entered a strange new age, a time when fear was policy and secrecy was law. The Cold War wasn't fought in trenches or with tanks, but through information. Every headline, every radio broadcast, every movie had the power to shape how millions saw the world, and the CIA knew it better than anyone. Operation Mockingbird had evolved from a small network of cooperative journalists into something far larger, a system so vast that even Congress couldn't see where its reach ended. Inside the CIA's headquarters in Washington, the operation was managed by a few key men. At the top was Frank Wisner, the architect of America's psychological warfare strategy. His deputy, Cord Meyer, handled the coordination, ensuring that the agency's influence reached from newspaper columns in New York to radio broadcasts in Europe. They called it media operations, but the truth was simpler. It was a system of quiet control, a way to turn free journalists into unwitting soldiers of information warfare. The process was subtle. The agency didn't need to force journalists to lie. All it had to do was guide them, shape what they saw, who they spoke to, and what they were told. In exchange for access to inside information, reporters were fed carefully curated intelligence. In a world obsessed with exclusives, no one questioned where the stories came from. At first, it seemed harmless. The Cold War was real. Soviet propaganda was everywhere. American journalists saw themselves as patriots. Working with the CIA didn't feel like corruption. It felt like duty. By the mid-1950s, more than 400 journalists worldwide had relationships with the agency. Some knew exactly what they were doing. Others had no idea their editors were on the payroll. The New York Times, Newsweek, Time, Life magazine, and CBS News were among the most influential outlets with covert ties. Their reporters could be persuaded to highlight certain events, downplay others, or write stories that reinforced the CIA's preferred version of global events. One of the agency's most trusted allies was Philip Graham, publisher of The Washington Post. Graham believed that journalism had a patriotic duty to support America's global role. Under his leadership, the Post became one of the CIA's most reliable media partners. Through Graham, the agency gained access to a network of editors, publishers, and correspondents across the country. In New York, Time magazine founder Henry Luce was another friend of the cause. Luce, who saw America as a divine force for good, allowed CIA-friendly journalists to work within his organization. Time and Life became central to the information war, shaping how Americans saw communism, democracy, and their own government. But the agency's reach didn't stop at journalism. It stretched into Hollywood, where screenwriters and producers collaborated to make sure films portrayed America's enemies as villains and its intelligence agencies as heroes. The CIA's liaison with the film industry quietly reviewed scripts, suggested plot changes, and even provided equipment or access in exchange for influence. Movies like Animal Farm, the animated adaptation of George Orwell's novel, were financed secretly by the CIA to promote anti-communist ideas. Even Mission, Impossible, and The Man from UNCLE was shaped by the image the agency wanted to project: clean, competent, heroic. The same strategy extended to universities, where professors received grants from CIA-funded foundations to research topics aligned with U.S. policy. Think tanks, student organizations, and cultural festivals were all part of what the agency called soft power. By the 1960s, the system was self-sustaining. The CIA didn't have to order journalists to write favorable stories. It simply fed information into an ecosystem that wanted to believe it. Editors and reporters trusted their sources, unaware that many of them were intelligence officers in disguise. Behind the scenes, the agency ran training programs for friendly reporters. They were taught how to interpret classified leaks, how to handle intelligence as news without revealing its origin. These were not spies in the traditional sense. They were influencers long before the term existed, and the effect was enormous. When the CIA orchestrated coups in Iran, 1953, and Guatemala, 1954, the American press described them as grassroots revolts led by freedom fighters. Few knew that the revolutionaries had been armed, trained, and directed by the CIA. When the United States intervened in Vietnam, newspapers published stories about the fight for democracy against communist aggression. The early coverage downplayed civilian deaths and exaggerated communist threats, narratives that came straight from CIA briefings. Even abroad, the agency's control was staggering. Through covert funding, it influenced newspapers in West Germany, France, Italy, and Japan. Foreign editors were paid to publish stories that supported US interests, creating the illusion of international consensus. Wisner's mighty Wurlitzer, as he once described it, could play any tune, and every instrument, from reporters to radio hosts, followed its rhythm. But the operation came at a cost. Frank Wisner, the man who built the machine, began to break down under the pressure. After years of running covert wars across the globe, he suffered a mental collapse in the late 1950s. The agency called it burnout. Those who knew him said he had seen too much, too many lies, too many ruined lives. In 1965, Wisner took his own life. His death marked the end of one era, but Operation Mockingbird lived on. Under Allen Dulles, the longest-serving CIA director, the agency's relationship with the press deepened. Dulles understood the importance of public image. During the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, journalists were quietly persuaded to suppress details of the CIA's role. The failure of the operation was blamed on Cuban resistance, not American planning. But the cracks were starting to show. The assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963 marked a turning point. As journalists began to investigate the CIA's activities in Cuba, Vietnam, and beyond, they encountered a wall of secrecy. Leaks began to surface, not from foreign agents, but from inside Washington itself. The first real glimpse into the CIA's manipulation of the press came in 1967, when Ramparts, a small San Francisco magazine, published an explosive exposé. The article revealed that the CIA had secretly funded the National Student Association, using it to influence student movements at home and abroad. The story sent shockwaves through the country. If the agency could infiltrate student organizations, what else had it infiltrated? Congress demanded answers. The agency stayed silent. But behind closed doors, nervous officials began to prepare for the inevitable reckoning. That reckoning came less than a decade later. In 1973, the Watergate scandal shattered public trust in government. When it was revealed that the CIA had helped cover up aspects of the break-in, journalists turned their attention to Langley. What else was the agency hiding? The answer arrived in 1975. The U.S. Senate created the Church Committee, named after Senator Frank Church, to investigate abuses by intelligence agencies. For the first time in American history, the CIA was forced to testify publicly about its covert operations. When investigators asked about media manipulation, agency officials were evasive. But under pressure, they admitted that the CIA had maintained relationships with journalists and editors around the world. The committee's report revealed something staggering. More than 50 major media organizations had worked, willingly or not, with the agency. Some journalists had been paid directly, others had received favors, travel, access, or exclusive information. The revelations were shocking, but the full story was even darker. Much of the evidence remained classified. The names of the journalists and outlets were redacted for national security. Still, the damage was done. The illusion of a free and independent press had been shattered. When the report was released, the CIA claimed that Operation Mockingbird had been shut down years earlier. They said the agency no longer engaged in domestic propaganda. The press moved on, comforted by the promise of reform. But behind the scenes, nothing really ended. The methods simply changed. The CIA no longer needed to put journalists on payrolls. By the late 1970s, the culture of cooperation was so deeply ingrained that it operated automatically. Reporters still called agency contacts for background. Editors still trusted official sources. The machine played on, quietly, efficiently, invisibly. In the coming decades, new wars would be fought not just in jungles or deserts, but in newsrooms and broadcast studios. And every time the government needed to justify its actions, in Nicaragua, Panama, or the Middle East, the same techniques would return. Operation Mockingbird had done its job too well. By the time the truth reached the public, the line between journalism and intelligence had already blurred beyond repair. And in a world that was about to be transformed by television, satellites, and eventually the internet, the CIA's experiment with information control was not ending. It was only evolving. When the Senate hearings ended in 1976, the headlines proclaimed that the age of government propaganda was over. The CIA, shamed by exposure, promised reforms. America, it seemed, could finally trust its press again. But inside Langley, the agency knew something no committee could stop. The world was changing, and information was evolving faster than laws could catch it. The printed word was no longer the only battlefield. Television had taken over, and pictures could now shape opinion more powerfully than any article. The CIA didn't need to pay journalists anymore. It only had to control the flow of information at its source. The official claim was that Operation Mockingbird had been terminated. In reality, it had simply become invisible. The methods of the Cold War gave way to new techniques: partnerships, leaks, access. The agency learned that a few well-placed narratives could steer entire populations without a single direct order. And the best part? No one would ever know it was happening. In the 1980s, a new era of covert influence began. The world had changed, but the mission remained the same: protect American interests, shape global perception, and win the information war. Under the Reagan administration, the CIA regained much of the freedom it had lost after the Church Committee. The new threat was no longer communism in Europe. It was insurgency in Central America, revolution in the Middle East, and drugs in South America. Each required its own narrative, and once again, the media became the delivery system. During the Iran-Contra affair, officials fed stories to friendly reporters to justify covert operations in Nicaragua. When the CIA mined Nicaraguan harbors and funded right-wing militias known as the Contras, news coverage emphasized the fight for freedom, rarely mentioning the civilian deaths or the violations of international law. In the same decade, the agency's connections with Hollywood deepened. Films like Top Gun and Red Dawn were made with direct Pentagon and CIA cooperation. Jet fighters, military bases, and equipment were provided in exchange for creative input, ensuring that the United States was always portrayed as the righteous power, the savior of the world. It was propaganda through entertainment, far more effective than anything Operation Mockingbird could have achieved with newspapers. As the Cold War ended in 1991, many believed the CIA's media influence would finally fade away. But instead, a new kind of empire was emerging, one built not on ideology but on information itself. The 1990s brought the rise of 24-hour news. CNN, Fox News, and other networks competed to deliver constant coverage. In this environment, speed became more valuable than accuracy. Reporters needed sources, and intelligence agencies had endless stories to offer. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the partnership between intelligence and media entered a new phase. Fear returned, and with it came secrecy. The global war on terror required public support, and support required control of the narrative. Major outlets relied on briefings from unnamed government sources. Officials leaked information about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, claims that later proved false, but not before they had done their job. News anchors repeated talking points almost verbatim. Columnists called for invasion. By the time the truth emerged, the war was already underway. It was Operation Mockingbird in digital form, no payoffs, no orders, just influence disguised as journalism. As the internet expanded, the battle for perception became decentralized. Millions of new voices appeared online, each claiming to tell the truth. Governments and corporations adapted. The CIA, once obsessed with newspapers, now watched social media, a new frontier of persuasion. Every click, every share, every headline became data. Algorithms replaced editors. The psychological warfare Frank Wisner had begun with newspapers in 1948 had evolved into something he could never have imagined: a self-sustaining ecosystem of manipulation. In 2013, Edward Snowden's leaks revealed the scale of the surveillance state that had quietly emerged. Intelligence agencies weren't just influencing the media, they were monitoring it. The National Security Agency, working closely with allied intelligence services, collected data from journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens alike. The justification was national security. The effect was chilling. When people know they're being watched, they start to censor themselves. Meanwhile, in the background, a new form of information warfare had taken root: digital influence operations. The CIA and its allies began studying how narratives spread online, how outrage could be weaponized, and how bots, trolls, and fake accounts could amplify certain viewpoints. And while the agency officially claimed to avoid domestic influence, the results were clear. The internet had become a global battlefield for belief. The term Operation Mockingbird disappeared from official memory, but the spirit of it lived on, rebranded, redefined, automated. Today, control doesn't come from one agency planting stories. It comes from networks, partnerships between intelligence, technology companies, and media conglomerates. The journalists of the 1950s were replaced by influencers, pundits, and algorithmic feeds. The manipulation is cleaner now, hidden beneath layers of convenience and entertainment. The modern reader doesn't need to be told what to think. Their preferences are mapped, analyzed, and catered to until they believe they've chosen freely. Even whistleblowers who try to expose manipulation find their stories buried by noise. Every revelation becomes just another trending topic, forgotten by the next news cycle. And yet, every once in a while, the mask slips. In 2014, The Intercept published leaked documents showing how Western intelligence agencies ran online disinformation campaigns, creating fake personas and spreading false narratives to influence public opinion. Around the same time, investigative journalists uncovered programs that funded fact-checking organizations and counter-disinformation initiatives, many of which were quietly supported by Western intelligence agencies and defense contractors. The methods are more sophisticated, but the principle remains the same: shape perception, guide belief, control reality. If Operation Mockingbird was about recruiting journalists, its modern version is about recruiting technology itself. Artificial intelligence now filters what billions of people see, deciding which truths are visible and which are hidden. The result is a world where control is nearly total, and yet invisible. Frank Wisner's mighty Wurlitzer no longer needs a human hand to play it. The machine plays itself. But the question that haunted journalists in the 1970s still lingers today. How can a democracy survive if its citizens can't trust the information they receive? The founders of Operation Mockingbird believed they were defending freedom. They saw propaganda as a necessary evil, a way to keep the public united in times of crisis. But decades later, the lines between defense and deception have blurred completely. When every side uses propaganda, when truth itself becomes a weapon, who can be trusted? The irony is that the CIA may no longer need to manipulate the press at all. In a world of infinite information, confusion itself has become the most powerful tool. If people can't tell what's real, they stop believing in anything, and a population that believes in nothing is easy to control. That is the true legacy of Operation Mockingbird. It began as a Cold War experiment, an attempt to outsmart Soviet propaganda. But over time, it became something else. A mirror showing how easily free societies can be bent by fear, by secrecy, and by the illusion of truth. The names have changed. The technology has changed. But the method endures, subtle, quiet, always one step ahead of understanding. In the 1950s, the CIA called it national security. In the 1980s, they called it public diplomacy. Today, they call it content moderation, influence operations, and strategic communications. Different words for the same idea, shaping what people think before they know they're thinking it. And the final twist? Operation Mockingbird was never just about the media. It was about us, our desire to believe, our fear of chaos, our trust in authority. The operation didn't end because it didn't need to. Once the system learned how easily humans could be guided by the stories they consume, the rest took care of itself. Now, every time you open a screen, scroll through your feed, or click a headline, remember: the game that began more than 70 years ago is still being played. It no longer needs spies, editors, or secret agents. It only needs attention. And that's the greatest success Operation Mockingbird ever achieved, teaching the world that the most effective form of control is not through censorship, but through distraction. Because when everyone is talking, when everyone has a platform, when every truth has an opposite truth, the signal disappears in the noise. And in that silence, hidden beneath the endless chatter, the real power speaks. It doesn't need to lie anymore, it only needs to decide what you'll hear next.